The third night of the harvest feast at Wexcombe Hall, a kitchen girl named Eleanor Hartwell stood at the foot of the great staircase, with a tureen of white soup in her chapped hands, and she watched a footman lift the silver ladle to the Earl's own bowl, and she knew with a certainty that turned her stomach to stone that the soup was wrong. It smelled of almonds where no almonds had been ordered. She had ground the blanched almonds herself for the second course, not the first, and the first had been made with cream and veal stock and nothing else, and yet the bowl set before the Earl of Wexcombe carried that thin, bitter sweetness underneath the cream, the smell of crushed cherry stones. The smell her grandmother had warned her against when she was a child, learning which berries killed and which only stained the fingers. The room was full of candlelight and laughing gentry, and a string quartet playing something gentle. And not one of those powdered, jeweled, glittering people noticed the girl in the gray dress go very still at the bottom of the stairs. She should have said nothing. A kitchen girl did not speak in the great dining room. A kitchen girl did not approach the high table. A kitchen girl who made a scene over a nobleman's soup would be turned out before morning, with no character and no wages. And she had a younger brother in the village who depended on those wages, and she knew all of this in the half-second before she moved. She moved anyway. To the house she was no one. A pair of hands that scrubbed and chopped and carried. A girl whose name the housekeeper sometimes forgot. You may already know how the world treats such a girl. Stay with me, because this house was about to learn her worth, and so was the man at the head of the table. The Earl had already lifted his spoon when she crossed the threshold. She was forbidden to cross. He was a tall man with a hard, still face, and eyes the color of cold slate. A man who had buried a brother and a father within the same dark year, and had not been seen to smile since, and he held the spoon halfway to his mouth, when a girl in a flour-dusted apron caught his wrist in both her hands and said, in a voice that shook but did not stop, that he must not drink it. The whole table went silent. The quartet faltered and recovered. 40 faces turned toward the foot of the table, toward the impossible sight of a servant's hands on the Earl of Wexcombe's sleeve, and the dowager at his right hand drew breath through her nose like a woman who has found a slug in her salad. "Take your hands off his lordship at once," the dowager said. Eleanor did not take her hands off. She looked only at the Earl, at those slate-gray eyes that had fixed on her with an attention that was not anger, an attention so total that for a moment she forgot the 40 staring faces and the ruin that was surely coming. "It is poisoned, my lord," she said. "I can smell it. Cherry stones or bitter almond. I beg you, do not drink." Her hands were trembling against the fine wool of his coat. His pulse beat steady under her thumb. He had not pulled away. For a long moment the Earl looked at her, and the room held its breath, and the candle flame stood very tall and very still. Then he set the spoon down. He did not drink. He turned the bowl in its place with one careful finger, looked at the pale surface, lifted it, and smelled it himself, and something moved behind his face that no one at that table could read. He set the bowl down again. He summoned his steward with 2 fingers and said low and level that the soup was to be sealed and given to no one, not even the dogs, and that the cook was to be brought to him in the morning. Then he looked back at the girl whose hands had finally fallen from his sleeve, and he asked her nothing, not her name, not how she knew, not who she was. He looked at her the way a man looks at a door he had not known was in the wall, and he said only, "You may go." She fled rather down the servants' passage with her heart slamming against her ribs, and behind her she heard the dowager's voice rise in a smooth, poisoned murmur about the impudence of kitchen sluts who fancied themselves physicians. And she heard a few of the gentry laugh, and she pressed her back against the cold stone of the larder wall and shook. She had saved his life. She was certain she had saved his life, and he had not asked her name. Eleanor was 23 years old and had been in service at Wexcombe Hall for 9 months, since the winter her father died and left nothing but debts and a boy of 11 to feed. Before that, she had not been a kitchen girl. Before that, she had been the daughter of an apothecary in the market town of Marlow, Raised among the green glass bottles and the brass scales and the great leather herbals, her father read aloud to her by the fire, and she had learned at his elbow the names and the virtues and the dangers of every growing thing. Learned to tell foxglove from comfrey by the leaf. Learned which doses healed and which killed. Learned the bitter almond smell of cherry laurel water that careless apothecaries kept for coughs, and that in the wrong measure stopped a heart. Her father had died, owing money he could not pay, and the shop had been sold over her head, and the only place that would take a girl with no character and no dowry was the scullery of a great house, where her knowledge was worth nothing, and her hands were worth a few shillings a quarter. She did not tell anyone in that house what she had been. A scullery maid who claimed to read Latin and knew the apothecary's art would be thought a liar or a witch, and either was dangerous. So she kept her head down and her sleeves rolled and let them call her the slow one, the quiet one, the girl who never spoke, and she sent her wages to the woman in the village who kept her brother, and she did not let herself want anything more than that. Wanting was a luxury for people the world had decided to see. The world had decided not to see Eleanor. To the house, she was a function, not a face. The morning after the feast, the kitchen was a battlefield. The cook, a heavy, florid woman named Mrs. Dada. Hell stood white and shaking before the steward, swearing on her mother's grave she had put nothing in that soup, and the steward's face was grim, and the underservants whispered behind their hands that someone would hang for this, and Eleanor scrubbed a pot in the corner and said nothing at all. She knew the cook had not done it. She had watched the soup made. The almonds had come later, after the tureen left the kitchen, somewhere in the long candlelit passage between the range and the high table, in hands that were not the cook's. Yet a kitchen girl's word would not save the cook, and might well hang Eleanor in her place, and so she held her tongue and scrubbed and hated herself a little for it. It was past noon when the summons came. The Earl wished to see the kitchen girl, who had stopped him drinking. The whole kitchen turned to look at her, and the cook's eyes went wide, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Dissel, Dunmore, gripped Eleanor's arm hard enough to bruise and hissed that she was to speak only when spoken to, and to keep her eyes down and not to shame the house. Eleanor untied her apron with hands that would not quite steady, smoothed her gray dress, and followed the footman up the back stairs and through a door, into a part of the house she had never seen, a long library with windows to the floor, and a fire burning low, and 10,000 books climbing the walls into shadow, and the Earl of Wexcombe standing at the far window with his back to her, a dark still figure against the white winter light. "You knew it was poisoned," he said without turning. How it was not quite a question. Eleanor kept her eyes on the carpet on the worn place near the hearth where his boots had stood 1,000 times, and she told him a careful half of the truth, that she had a good nose, that she had smelled bitter almond, that her father had been an apothecary and had taught her the smell of cherry laurel before she could read. At the word apothecary he turned. She felt his attention land on her like a weight, and she kept her eyes down, and the fire popped in the grate. "Look at me," he said. She looked. His face was as hard and still as it had been at the table, but his eyes had changed. There was something behind the slate now, something searching. "An apothecary's daughter, scrubbing pots in my scullery. My father died, my lord. The shop was sold. A girl must eat." She did not say more. She did not say that she read Greek, that she could set a bone and dress a wound, that she had once been someone. Self-pity was a door she kept locked. He studied her for a long moment, and she thought she saw, just for an instant, something tighten at the corner of his jaw, as though her plain account of ruin had touched a place in him that ruin had touched before. "What is your name?" he began to say. And then a knock came at the library door, and the steward entered with the magistrate's man. And the moment closed like water over a stone, and the Earl turned away to the business of the investigation, and Eleanor was dismissed back to the kitchen with her name once again unspoken. She told herself it did not matter. She told herself a great many things, walking down the back stairs, and her treacherous heart did not believe a single one of them, because she had felt the weight of his looking, and her body had answered it before her mind could forbid it. A warmth that climbed her throat, a quickening she had no right to feel. She gripped the cold iron of the stair-rail and made herself breathe. He was an earl. She was a pair of hands. There was nothing in the world more impossible. In the days that followed, the house filled with people, for the earl had not sent his guests away, and the harvest gathering became a fortnight's party, and at the center of it sat the Dowager Lady Wexcombe, his late father's widow, his stepmother. A woman of 60 with a spine like a poker, and a fortune of her own, and a fixed and absolute conviction that she alone stood between the family name and ruin. The Dowager had a candidate for the Earl's hand, and the candidate was her own great-niece, Miss Augusta Vane, a polished beauty of 19 with £10,000 and a laugh like breaking glass, and the Dowager had spent 2 seasons arranging the match the way a general arranges a siege, and she did not intend to be thwarted by a poisoning, a scandal, or, above all, by a kitchen girl who had made herself conspicuous. "The creature wants watching," the Dowager said to Miss Vane in the morning room, not troubling to lower her voice as Eleanor knelt at the hearth laying the fire. "A scullery slut who flings herself at his lordship in front of 40 people and calls it saving his life. I have seen the type. They aim above their station and they bring down everything around them. Mark me, she will be gone by Michaelmas, and good riddance." Miss Vane laughed her breaking glass laugh and said she could not imagine what the girl had been thinking, and Eleanor finished the fire with steady hands and carried out the ash bucket and did not let her face change at all. The label landed and lodged, a scullery slut who aimed above her station. She had been called worse. It still found the soft place under her ribs and pressed. The Earl did not send her back entirely to the scullery, as it turned out. The next week brought a quiet word from the steward. His lordship's young ward, Master Thomas, had been unwell, and the kitchen girl who knew the apothecary's art was to attend the nursery and see what might be done. Thomas was 6 years old, the orphaned son of the Earl's dead brother, a small, grave, silent child who had not spoken more than a dozen words since the black year took his father, and the nursemaids had given him up as simple or broken, and the Dowager had let it be known that the boy was an embarrassment best kept out of sight. Eleanor climbed to the nursery expecting a sickly child, and found instead a thin, pale boy sitting alone at a window with a wooden horse in his lap, watching the rooks wheel over the bare trees, and something in her cracked clean through because she knew that particular stillness. She had worn it herself. It was the stillness of a child. The world had stopped seeing. She did not dose him with anything. There was nothing wrong with his body that she could find. No fever, no flux, only a cough that a little honey and horehound would ease. And so she made the cough syrup in the still room, and brought it up herself. And she sat with him while he drank it. And she did not fill the silence with chatter the way the nursemaids did. She simply sat. The boy watched her sideways, the way a wild thing watches, and she let him watch, and she mended the hem of her apron by the window light, and asked him nothing. On the second day she brought a sprig of dried lavender, and crushed it under his nose and named it for him, and told him it was good for aching heads and for sleep that would not come. On the third day she brought rosemary and thyme and a dried rose, and named each one, and told him in a low, even voice what each was good for, the way her father had once told her: rosemary for remembrance and the steadying of a faint heart, thyme for the chest and for courage, the rose for nothing at all except that it was beautiful, and that a person was allowed to keep beautiful things for no reason. The boy listened to all of it, with his grave dark eyes fixed on her hands. On the fourth day, the boy said, in a small, rusty voice, "What is this one?" and held out his hand for the herb she had brought, a gray-green sprig of sage, and Eleanor told him its name and its virtue. And then he said, smaller still, "My father used to bring me things from the garden," and he looked at her to see what she would do with that, whether she would flinch from it the way the grown people flinched, whether she would tell him hush, and not to speak of his father, and Eleanor did not flinch. She said that his father had sounded like a man who knew what a small thing could mean to a person, and that she thought he would have liked the sage, and the boy looked at the sprig in his palm for a long while, and then he smiled, a small, uncertain thing. The first smile anyone in that house had seen on that small, grave face in more than a year. And Eleanor had to turn her face to the window, so he would not see her weep. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that the Earl stood in the half-open doorway of the nursery on that 4th afternoon and watched the whole of it. He had come to look in on the boy, as he did each day. A duty he performed in silence because he did not know how to perform it any other way, and he had stopped in the doorway when he heard a voice he did not expect. And he had stood there in the shadow of the passage and watched a kitchen girl in a gray dress draw his brother's son back into the world with a sprig of dried thyme. He watched the boy speak. He watched the boy smile, the first smile anyone in that house had seen on that small, grave face in more than a year. And he watched the girl turn to the window to hide her tears, and he did not announce himself, and he went away down the passage as silently as he had come. And that night at dinner he was more silent than usual, and the Dowager thought it was the strain of the investigation, and she was wrong. The investigation, meanwhile, had found its way to an ugly place. The magistrate's man had determined that the poison was indeed cherry laurel water, that it had been added to the Earl's bowl alone, and to no other, and that whoever had done it had access to the passage between kitchen and hall during the service of the first course. Suspicion fell naturally and conveniently upon the servants, and the steward drew up a list, and the cook wept, and a footman was dismissed on no evidence at all. And Eleanor watched the machinery of the house grind toward a verdict that would satisfy everyone except the truth. She knew the poison had not come from the kitchen. She had a suspicion, growing colder and clearer by the day, about whose interest was served by the Earl's death, and whose by his marriage. But a kitchen girl did not accuse a dowager countess, and so she gathered what she could and held it, and waited. She saw the Earl again on a gray afternoon in the still room, where she had gone to make up more of the boy's cough syrup. He came in without knocking, filling the low doorway, and she rose so fast she knocked a brass scale askew, and he crossed the flagged floor and set it right with one hand before she could, and they were standing very close in the herb-scented dimness, closer than they had ever been, and neither of them moved away. "The boy is speaking," he said. His voice was low. "He spoke to me this morning. He has not spoken to me in a year." Eleanor said she was glad, my lord. Very glad. And her voice came out lower than she meant it to, and she was aware of exactly where he stood. The heat of him, the breadth of his shoulders blocking the light, the way her own pulse had begun to beat in her throat where he could surely see it. He was quiet a moment, and then he said a thing she had not expected, said it to the row of drying herbs and not to her, in the flat, careful voice of a man laying down a weight he had carried too long. His brother had been the warm one, he said. His brother had been the one the boy loved, the one who laughed and rode and filled the rooms of the hall with noise. And his brother had taken a fever in the spring and been dead inside a week. And the Earl had sat at the bedside the whole of that week and had been able to do nothing at all. No fortune of any use against a thing so small as a fever. He had promised his brother, in the last clear hour, that he would raise the boy as his own, and then he had found that he did not know how. He had stood at the edge of the child's grief like a man at the edge of cold water, and had not known how to go in. He had thought, until 4 days past, that he had failed, the only promise that had ever mattered to him, the way he had failed at the bedside, with everything and nothing in his hands. Eleanor did not move. She understood, all at once, the stillness of him, the coldness the whole county feared. It was not coldness at all, but the held breath of a man afraid that if he let himself feel the one grief he would feel all of them. She understood the daily silent visits to a nursery. He did not know how to enter. She understood why he had watched a kitchen girl name herbs for a child and had not been able to look away. He had carried his brother's death the way she carried her father's, locked behind a door, and he had just, for reasons she could not fathom, opened the door a crack and let her see in. "You did not fail him," she said. The words came out before her caution could catch them. A child does not need to be taught how to grieve. He needs only to be sat with until he is ready to come back. You have been sitting with him every day for a year. That is not failing. That is waiting. The Earl turned his head and looked at her then, and whatever he had braced himself to hear, it had not been that. And something in the slate eyes broke and reformed, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. "Sit down," he said at last. "You have been on your feet since before dawn. Sit." It was a command, flat and dominant, and she heard the order in it, and obeyed before she understood that the order was a kindness, that he had noticed she was tired, that the harshness was the only language he had for care. She sat on the still-room stool, and he stood over her, and for a moment he did nothing at all, only looked down at her in the green dimness. And then he reached out, and with one finger, turned her chapped and reddened hand palm upward on her knee, and looked at the cracks and calluses the lie had made. And something crossed his face that she would remember for the rest of her life. He did not speak. He set her hand down gently, as though it were something that mattered, and he left the still room without another word. And Eleanor sat among the drying herbs with her heart going like a struck bell, and the print of his touch burning on her palm. That night she could not sleep. She lay on her narrow cot under the eaves, and listened to the other maids breathing, and tried to be sensible, tried to remember that men like the Earl of Wexcombe did not look twice at scullery maids except to ruin them, that the dowager was right about the type and the danger, that the only safe course was to keep her head down and her heart locked and do her work, and send her wages home. And underneath all that, good sense, her body told her a different and undeniable thing, that when he had turned her hand over in his she had wanted, with a wanting so plain and so physical it frightened her, for him to keep holding it. She pressed her face into the thin pillow. Wanting was the most dangerous thing a girl in her position could do. She wanted anyway. The dowager, too, had not been idle. She had seen the Earl come back from the nursery with something changed in his face, and she had heard from Miss Vane's maid that his lordship had been seen entering the still room where the kitchen girl worked, and the dowager had survived 60 years in a world of glances and whispers by reading exactly such signs, and she did not like what she read. She summoned Eleanor to the morning room on a pretext of a complaint about the linen, and when the girl came, she dismissed the footman and let a silence stretch. And then she said in a voice like cool silk that she would speak plainly. "You have a clever look about you," the dowager said, "and clever girls of your station always come to the same end. I will give you 20 pounds. You will take it, and you will go to your people, and you will not be here when the family announces my great-niece's engagement to his lordship next week. 20 pounds is more than you will see in 5 years of scrubbing. Refuse it, and I will see you turned out without a character and your name made such that no respectable house will take you. And your little brother, I think, will learn what it is to go hungry. Do we understand one another?" Eleanor stood very still. 20 pounds. It would clear her father's last debts and keep her brother for 2 years, and let her find a place far from here where she could forget the weight of a pair of slate-gray eyes. It was the sensible thing. It was the only thing. And she heard herself say in a voice quieter and steadier than she felt, "I will take no money to leave a house where a man's life may still be in danger. My lord's mother, the one who poisoned the Earl's soup, has not been found. Until they are, I will not go." The dowager's face did not move, but something flickered far back in her eyes, and Eleanor understood in that frozen instant that she had said too much, that she had let the dowager see she suspected, and that she had just made an enemy who did not lose. "Insolent," the dowager said softly. "Insolent and ambitious. I gave you a kindness and you spit on it. Very well, remember that you chose this." And Eleanor was dismissed, and she walked back down to the kitchen, knowing she had thrown away 20 pounds and bought herself something far more costly, and she could not for her life have done otherwise. If you have ever loved a story where the quiet one is finally seen, stay with me now, because the night of the reckoning was coming, and it was coming faster than Eleanor knew. The blow fell 3 days later, and it fell, as the dowager's blows always did, in public. The family and the lingering guests had assembled in the great drawing-room before dinner. Candlelight and silk, and the smell of hothouse flowers, and Miss Vane at the pianoforte playing prettily, and the Earl standing apart by the tall windows, as he always stood, when the dowager rose and tapped her fan against her glass and said she had an announcement that touched the honor of the house. A silver locket had gone missing from her own dressing table, she said, an heirloom of great value, and a search of the servants' quarters had turned it up, and she paused there for effect, in the box beneath the bed of the kitchen girl who had so lately and so conspicuously thrust herself into the family's affairs. The footman beside her held up the locket. Every face in the room turned to the doorway where Eleanor had been brought, held between two grooms, white to the lips. I tried to be merciful to her, the dowager said to the room, in a voice rich with sorrowful triumph. I offered her money to go quietly. She refused it, and now we see why. A thief and a schemer, who wormed her way to his lordship's notice, with a piece of theatre over a bowl of soup. There is your physician, there is your heroine. A common thief from the scullery, and behind her, I have no doubt, the whole sorry business of the poison itself. She let the word hang. The room understood. Not only a thief now, but the poisoner, the author of the very crime she had pretended to prevent, and Eleanor saw the verdict settle on every powdered face at once, saw the guests draw back, saw Miss Vane's hand rise to her mouth in delicate horror, and she knew that the locket had been put in her box by the same hand that had put almonds in the soup, and that there was no one in that gilded room who would take her word over a countess's, and that she was, very simply, lost. She is a thief and a poisoner, the dowager said again, driving the label home for the third time, in the third place, before the largest audience of all, and she will hang for it. And Eleanor, who had locked the door on self-pity for 9 long months, who had borne the loss of her father and her home and her name, without complaint, found that she had at the last one thing left to say, and she lifted her head and said it clearly into the silence. I have never stolen anything in my life. I knew the soup was poisoned because my father was an apothecary and taught me the smell of cherry laurel, and I stopped his lordship drinking it because I would stop any man drinking it, lord or beggar, and if that is a hanging crime, then hang me. But I will not stand here and be called a poisoner by the one person in this house who profits by his death. Her voice did not break. The room gasped. The dowager went the color of ash, and from the tall windows into the ringing silence that followed came the sound of a single pair of boots crossing the floor. The Earl of Wexcombe walked the length of his drawing-room in long, unhurried strides, and the crowd parted before him, and he did not look at the dowager, or at the locket, or at Miss Vane, frozen at the pianoforte. He looked only at the girl held between the two grooms, and when he reached her, he stopped, and he said, "Release her." And the grooms let go so fast she swayed, and he put out his hand and steadied her by the elbow, in front of all of them, the Earl of Wexcombe's bare hand on a kitchen girl's arm. Then he turned to face the room, with Eleanor at his side, and he was no longer silent, and his face was no longer still. It had come alive with a cold, controlled fury that was somehow more dreadful than any shouting. I stood in the nursery doorway 4 days past, he said, level and carrying, and watched this woman bring my brother's son back from a silence I had begun to fear was permanent. I have watched her refuse money to leave when staying might cost her life. And I am informed by the magistrate's man, who has been at his work these 2 weeks, that the cherry laurel water that nearly killed me was purchased in Marlow 6 months ago by a manservant in this household, on an errand whose paymaster he has this morning named. He let that fall. He did not name her. He did not have to. Every eye in the room went to the dowager, who had begun very slightly to tremble, her fan slipping in her fingers. You wish to know who profited by my death, the Earl said to the room, but for her. And then he turned from all of them, from the collapsing dowager and the gaping guests in the heirloom locket lying on the silver tray, and he looked down at Eleanor, and into the absolute silence of that crowded room. He said the thing that ended it. "Miss Hartwell stays." "As my wife?" No one breathed. The dowager's fan struck the floor. Eleanor stood with the whole gilded world tilting around her, and looked up into the slate-gray eyes that had found her at the foot of the staircase 9 months and a lifetime ago, and saw that he meant it, saw that he had known her name all along, had carried it like something kept. Before the very people who had decided she did not have one, he had asked her nothing on the night she saved him. He had no need to ask. He had simply, quietly, found out the way a careful man finds out everything that matters, and he had waited until he could lay her name down like a shield in front of the whole assembled house. The magistrate's man came forward then, and the manservant was named, and the dowager's part in it was laid bare in the flat, dreadful language of evidence. The purchase, the payment, the locket she had ordered planted, and the room that had been so ready to see Eleanor hang now turned its collective face away from the woman who had ruled it for 30 years. Lady Wexcombe was not dragged out in chains. The Earl was not a man for spectacle, and there was the family name to consider. She was removed, quietly and completely, to the dower house at the far edge of the estate, and a strict allowance, and the permanent loss of the only thing she had ever truly valued, which was her command of the house and her place at its center. Miss Vane and her £10,000 went home to her mother within the week. The footman who had been dismissed was recalled and paid his back wages. And Mrs. Pell, weeping for the 3rd time, but for joy now made a wedding cake, the like of which Wexcombe Hall had not seen in living memory. They were married quietly in the parish church, on a clear, cold morning at the turn of the year, with the frost still white, on the gravestones and the bells ringing thin and bright across the fields, and there was no great society crowd, only the household and the village, and a small grave boy in a new blue coat, who stood at the front and watched the kitchen girl who had named the herbs for him become the lady of the house. Eleanor wore a gown of soft cream wool that the Earl had ordered made for her, and carried a sprig of dried lavender at her wrist instead of hothouse flowers. And when the vicar asked her name, she gave it full and clear, Eleanor Hartwell, in a voice that did not shake at all. And the man beside her listened to her say it, as though it were the only music he had ever wished to hear. The first snow came on Christmas Eve, soft and silent, filling the dark beyond the library windows. Eleanor sat by the great fire with the boy Thomas, asleep against her shoulder, his wooden horse fallen from his hand onto the hearthrug, and across the room her husband stood at the tall window watching the snow come down. The firelight warm on the hard face that had learned, slowly and only with her, how to be still in a different way, a quiet way, a way that had nothing of grief in it. On the small table at her elbow lay the worn leather herbal her father had read to her by another fire, in another life, recovered at last from the man who had bought the shop, its pages soft with handling, its margins full of her father's small, precise notes. She had thought it lost with everything else. The Earl had found it, the way he found everything that mattered, and he had set it on her table without a word, and that was how he said the things he could not say. He crossed the room and stood looking down at the sleeping boy and the woman who held him, and the snow fell, and the fire settled, and he laid his hand very lightly on her hair. She turned her face up to him. Outside the window the whole white world had gone soft and silent, and inside it was only the 3 of them, and the fire, and the old book on the table, and the long year of grief had finally, fully, let go of the house. He had never asked her name on the night she saved his life. He had not needed to ask. He had only needed to keep it, and to wait, and to give it back to her at last, made new. A name no one in that house would ever again forget. Thank you for staying to the end of Eleanor's story. If a quiet moment in it moved you, I would be glad to know which one. Until the next tale, be warm and be well.